कृतं येन भूतले स्वयं रूपा कदा मह्यं ददाति स्वपदान्तिकं वन्देऽहं श्रीगुरु श्रीयुतापदकमलं श्रीगुरुन् वैष्णवांश्च श्रीरूपं साग्रजातां सहगना रघुनाथान्वितं तं सजीवं साद्वैतं सावधूतं परिजनसहितं कृष्णचैतन्यदेवं श्रीराधा कृष्णपदान् सहगना ललिता श्रीविशाखान्वितंश्च हे कृष्ण करुणा सिन्धु दीनबन्धु जगत्पते गोपेश गोपिका कान्ता राधा कान्ता नमोस्तुते अप्तकाञ्चन गौराङ्गी राधे वृन्दावनेश्वरी वृषभानुसुते देवी प्रणमामि हरिप्रिये नमो महावदन्याय कृष्णप्रेमप्रदायते कृष्णाय कृष्णचैतन्य नाम्ने गौरतुषे नमः वाञ्छकल्पतरुभ्यश्च कृपासिन्धुभ्य एव च पतितानां पावनेभ्यो वैष्णवेभ्यो नमो नमः श्रीकृष्णचैतन्य प्रभुनित्यानन्द श्री अद्वैत गदाधर श्रीवासादि गौरभक्तवृन्द हरे कृष्णा 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 हरे 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 राम 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 हरे हरे. I seek the blessings of all the assembled Vaishnavas that the beauty and the depth of the fifth canto, as given by Srila Prabhupada and other Vaishnavas that we have heard and learned from, may be properly presented. Because this is an overview presentation, the idea or the title of the presentation would be Themes and Instructions, or rather themes and select important verses that run throughout the fifth canto. The central theme that runs throughout the fifth canto is sthana. Now, this topic starts actually in the second canto of Bhagavatam, when Parikshit Maharaj begins to ask questions of Sukadeva Goswami after his initial two questions posed at the end of the first canto have been addressed. So at the end of the first canto, he has asked, what is the essential duty for a person in life, and what is the essential duty for a person, especially when he's about to pass away? Now, the first three chapters of the second canto are an answer to this specific question. And in answering this question, Sukadeva Goswami has presented two paths, basically, that were common in that day and age for self-realization. One was the path of jnana, which is mentioned in the fifth chapter of Bhagavad Gita, more elaborately described in the second canto, second chapter actually, and the path of yoga, described from about verse 15 of the first chapter of the second canto. And his conclusion after describing both these paths is that devotional service is still superior. So just directly here and chant about Krishna. In the third chapter, he deals with the karmakanda process, and he says, even if one has material desires, still approach Krishna. So in the fourth chapter, Parikshit Maharaj begins to ask deeper questions about what he has heard. He wants to hear about the Purusha avatars. He wants to understand how the Lord creates, maintains, and destroys the universe again. He asks, what are the Shaktis on which, using which the Lord creates and maintains this universe? He wants to understand how the gunas of Prakriti are managed by the Lord in this process. So these seed questions give rise to an original presentation of Bhagavatam given by Lord Brahma to Narada. So in our parampara, we have the Lord, Brahma, Narada, Vyasa, etc. So the fifth, sixth, and seventh chapters of the second canto then are a description in that lineage between Brahma and Narada. And in that conversation, it is highlighted that it is the Lord, as in the Purusha avatars, who actually conducts the sarga, so to speak, or the original creation of the material world. Now, after hearing these answers, particularly in the 8th chapter of the second canto, Parikshit Maharaj begins to ask in a string of verses. I think it goes from verse 7 to 24, so it's 18 verses. Maharaj Parikshit begins to ask very detailed questions. asking in more depth, if there's anything more about the creation of the universe, please let me know. But more specifically, he asks, speak also, and this is 2, 8, 16, 17, speak also about the creation of the earth, Patala Loka, the directions, the sky, the planets, constellations, mountains, rivers, oceans, and islands, the creation of the various inhabitants and what jivas attain those places. Speak about the dimensions of the universe, outside and inside, the activities of great souls, and so on and so forth. So these were the questions that Maharaj Parikshit had asked in the second canto. And Sukadeva Goswami, in response, he begins by narrating a little bit more about the original sarga, and in the conclusion of the 8th and the 9th chapters of the second canto, he describes the original presentation of the Bhagavatam by the Lord to Brahma. So we've already seen Brahma to Narada, now we see the Lord to Brahma. And in the 10th chapter, he starts the chapter by saying, all your questions are actually, at the end of the 9th chapter, all your questions are addressed by this text of Bhagavatam. In fact, Sukadeva Goswami has already made this point in the 4th chapter. But now he's continuing that thread from the 4th chapter of the second canto. And then he begins to quote this verse, Atra sarga visargascha sthanam poshanam utaya manvantara ishanukata nirodha muktirashraya. So these 10 topics form the content or the themes that run through each of the 10 cantos. And we have often heard that the principal 9 themes are a point 1, 2, and help one actually take shelter of Ashraya, who's Krishna, mentioned in the 10th canto of Bhagavatam. Now, one of those topics, or rather, the topic of Sarga, principal creation, is mainly covered in the second canto. The topic of Visarga, secondary creation, is covered principally in the 3rd and 4th cantos. The topic of Sthana, and we will describe what that means, is covered in the 5th canto. So it is useful, I've found, to understand the pastimes that are narrated, the history, the chronologies, the instructions that are found in the context of this theme, when trying to understand what does this canto overall teach me? How does it bring me closer to taking shelter of Krishna? If we can just take a very brief step back and even think about what these 10 topics represent. When we think about, these Sanskrit terms, sarga, visarga, sthana, poshana, it seems very esoteric in some sense. The natural question is, why these particular 10 topics? Why are they important to the Srimad Bhagavatam? Well, in actual fact, every Mahapurana, and there are 18 principal such Mahapuranas, cover these 10 topics, sarga, visarga, sthana, poshana, etc. And this is why they do it. When Prabhupada comments in the first canto, in the second purport, he says, the most natural instinct for a person is just to look at the sky and ask, where's all this come from? Who's the source of this? These 2 questions actually, who has created all this, or where has everything come from? And how do I come from all of this? Are the most fundamental questions for every person. And therefore Prabhupada used to say that Darwin's theory and Big Bang, the concept, these are the 2 main enemies that cause people to deviate away from religious principles. And the Bhaktivedanta Institute is meant to address these 2 principles. But when we read Bhagavatam and we understand the same answer to the same questions through to Sarga, Visarga, we understand cosmology and we understand our origin, how everything was created. Sthana is, we will translate it more precisely later on, but it is geography. Poshana is, and it also represents governmental management, how the universe is managed. 6 refers to the special protection offered by the Lord. 7 is Utaya, which is psychology at its deepest level. Manvantarakata is how the principles of Dharma is maintained. So again, good governance. 9 represents Ishanukata, which is topics of the Lord and the devotees. That is those examples of people who have maintained these religious principles, even despite having difficult circumstances to live through. When we look at 11, how in all of this tabernacle to leave. So that's mukti. And nirodha, which is destruction, is the topic of the 12th canto. Where does all this go? So understanding these 9 topics is education as we understand it even from school. When we go to school, we study history, geography, psychology, etc. Because if I know, for example, 40,000 years ago, according to what we're taught in textbooks, the first Aboriginal people came to Australia. Then Cook came some, I don't know, was it 200, 250 years ago? But then you had the Chinese gold rush. Then the Greeks came at a certain point. And then you had Indians come in at around in 1980s or so. But when you understand the sociological history, you understand the society around you and your place in it, our place in it. And through the education that we receive in school, right from the beginning up to our graduation, we are taught Sambandha, Abhideya, Prayojana in a unique way. We are taught Sambandha, that we are nothing but the body. That is gearing towards which education is based. Through the way history is enumerated, simply the rise and fall of civilizations, the way history is described in terms of how people have gained power, the way governments are currently run. When we think about a goal in life, if we're just the body, then implicitly the goal we're given through our education is that now we have one life, experience all that you can. And the process that we are taught, the Abhideya, through the entire process of education, is that you study, you move, you find a position in society, you get a job, you have a house, you have a car. So this is implicitly what is ingrained in us from covering history, geography, psychology, etc. The Bhagavatam does the same thing, but it connects all these topics to the Lord. So then the result of hearing these topics is understanding Sambandha, that we are eternally servants and we are dependent on the Lord. The Prayojana, to redevelop our relationship with Him in a loving relationship, in prema. And the process, devotional service. And it gives us an understanding of who we are and what our life is meant for. So Bhagavatam is really education, and that was the purpose of all the Puranas. The other Puranas cover these topics in such a way as to elevate their readers from whatever platform they are to a certain level. So therefore, for example, you would have the Shiva Purana, which presents everything in connection with Lord Shiva. In the Bhagavatam also it is mentioned, for example, Otam Protam. It's like Lord Shiva represents, like if you have a piece of cloth, he represents the threads that go both vertically and horizontally. But Bhagavatam then takes that view and helps us understand how Lord Shiva's power and strength depends on Krishna, which helps us understand that even if Shiva is the agency through which the universe is managed in this way, still it's ultimately Krishna's strength and potency that governs everything. So Bhagavatam then takes us from where we are and gives us the highest type of understanding, highest level of education. And when these 9 topics are covered properly, one comes to understand that everything that I'm seeing is Krishna's potency. And therefore one is able, if I'm taking pleasure, for example, in the beauty of a hill, this is nothing but Krishna's beauty. It's nothing but Krishna's potency. And one is actually able to walk through the gate of surrender, which allows one access to the topics of the 10th canto. So, the 5th chapter, 5th canto, describes sthana. Now, sthana has various meanings. The essential, the Sanskrit word is lakshana, the essential indication given by that word sthana is the general protection offered by the Lord to the living entities. So we have a government and how they generally organize your councils, your road systems, your police force. It is not specific to a particular individual. Whereas if you look at Poshana, which is a 6th canto, there that refers to for those people who are like practicing devotional service. If there are accidental mistakes, how the Lord protects them. So therefore we have the pastimes of Ajamil, we have the pastime of Indra, but then, for example, we hear and Vritrasura and Mara Chitraketu, but then we also hear of instances where, who was Sati's father again? It just skipped my mind. Daksha, how Daksha was not protected, and that was because of the offense he had committed towards Lord Shiva. So we hear of where and how the Lord's mercy and protection applies to specific devotees, but sthana refers to general protection of the universe. Imagine if we didn't know how our councils operated. We would be left to kind of fend for ourselves. But if we understand what the Lord has done to protect us, maintain us, it allows us to take further shelter of Him. It also refers, this is another understanding of sthana, it refers to the proper protection of the different rules established by the Lord for different classes of living entities. So dharma for higher level living entities and for living entities in lower planetary systems and for people in Bhumandala is different. Even across ages it is different. For example, in a previous age, we have that verse, Ashwamedha Gavalambam Samyasa Palapatrikam Daivarena Sudotpattim Kalau Pancha Vivarjayet. So there were, like in Kali Yuga it is mentioned, there are 5 things that are forbidden in this age. One of them being offering meat to one's ancestors, or begetting a child in one's wife if one is unable to conceive a child through one's own brother, so the wife's brother-in-law. So this was dharma for a previous age for people to grow in their own way. But there are many, many classes of living beings, and some in the higher planetary systems have a different rule and dharma that is applicable to them. For example, for the devatas, they are, even if, for example, they come late to the court where they're supposed to be, that is a transgression and they're punished for it. It is considered they're not acting according to duty, they've allowed their senses to be carried away. Similarly, in the nether planetary systems, in the lower planetary systems, again, for different races of asuras or such beings, there are again different set of rules that apply according to their consciousness and how they are gradually to be elevated. So the proper protection of these rules by the Lord is also called sthana. And we will see this particularly in the 16th, 17th, and 18th chapters of the 5th canto, where the Jambudvipa is described. And in each of the 9 islands, you have extensive prayers offered by each of the living entities to the Lord. This is by one of the chief living entities. By their offering prayers to the Lord, and by the Lord protecting them in that way, sthana is established. Then when again each of the other 6 islands are described, again the particular prayer and the particular deity they worship is described in brief, because that is their relationship with the Lord. They offer their gratitude and prayers to the Lord, and the Lord maintains them in that way. So the verse actually in the 2nd canto that describes this describes sthana is Sthitir Vaikunta Vijaya. So Vaikunta is a name for the Lord, and Vaikunta Vijaya means creation, or it can also mean the Lord who Vijay conquers over the suffering of the jivas. And so Sthiti refers to that general protection of the Lord by the living entities, how He protects their dharma, how He protects their maintenance, and how He protects the principles by which they can attain Him individually. Now if we go, this is from a thematic perspective, the topic of the 5th canto. In terms of chronology, in the middle of the 3rd canto, Vidura had asked a question about Manu's lineage, because after describing secondary creation by Brahma in the 3rd canto, there is a description of Brahma's children and how they started to populate the worlds. So Vidura one of the questions he asked was about Manu's family. The reason being that Manu's family was extremely Krishna conscious, and their activities have established Krishna consciousness in different parts of the world in different ways. And 2 particular lineages are described extensively in the Bhagavatam. One is the lineage coming from Uttanapad, and the other one from Priyavrata. So Uttanapad is particularly described in the 4th canto. Devahuti's incidences and pastimes are described at the end of the 3rd canto. Akuti is briefly described in the 1st chapter of the 4th canto with her marriage to Ruchi. And Prasuti's marriage to Daksha is described briefly afterwards, and then you have the whole Sati and Lord Shiva incident. And then when Uttanapad is started, that starts the lineage from Dhruva Maharaj onto the Prachetas. Now, the beginning of the fifth canto, the history is this, that even though you had Uttanapad and Priyavrata, who were both sons of Manu, Priyavrata, he had acquired knowledge of self-realization very quickly. We saw in the fourth canto how Uttanapad had married two wives, Suniti and Suruchi. He was particularly attached to Suruchi. So he was Krishna conscious, but not completely detached from this world. And his lineage had gone down to the Prachetas and Barhishat. And Barhishat and the Prachetas had both been delivered by Narada. And so that lineage kind of ended. Now, there was nobody to rule the world. And so it was Priyavrata, who was the surviving son of Manu, who was still qualified and capable of ruling this world. And so the fifth canto begins by seeking an appropriate devotee, a qualified devotee, who could take charge of ruling the world. And it's really, really amazing how the first chapters of every canto, how the theme of that canto is brought out. One of my favorites is actually the 11th canto, for example, which deals with mukti. And the very first 5 chapters, you see a verse at the end of those first 5 chapters of the 11th canto, and it is described that this conversation between the Nava-Yogendras, whose birth we will see in the 5th canto, these Nava-Yogendras, the conversation they've had with Maharaj Nimi establishes the general discussion for mukti that is always quoted. And in one conversation, mentioned in those first 5 chapters, all the principles with regard to mukti are described in detail, with devotional service being highlighted. And then the rest of the 11th canto expands on those principles. We see that with the 6th canto also. When we're dealing with the Lord's protection, perhaps the strongest example is highlighted in the case of Ajamil in the first 3 chapters. And then the principles are elaborated in the rest of the canto. So it's like an extraordinary preview of the theme of that canto, and the rest of the chapters follow. The preview given in the 5th canto is specifically with respect to Maharaj Priyavrata. Now, in the chronology of the Bhagavatam, at the end of the 4th canto, in the 31st chapter, Sukadeva Goswami says, I have finished telling you about the descendants of Uttanapad. I will now tell you about the activities of the descendants of Priyavrata, the first son of Swayambhavu Manu. Please hear them attentively. Text 27. Although Maharaj Priyavrata received instructions from the great sage Narada, he is still engaged in ruling the earth. After fully enjoying material possessions, he divided the property among his sons. He then attained a position by which he could return home back to Godhead. And Parikshit Maharaj kind of briefly stops him there. He says, you told me just now that Narada had instructed Priyavrata in knowledge of the spirit soul. Now, it was also described that he had fully accepted that knowledge, and he was acting on the platform of the spirit soul. So when he was acting on the platform of the spirit soul, he no longer identified himself as being a man. He didn't need somebody to complete his happiness. He was happy in his relationship with Krishna. Why then did he seek a relationship with a wife? Why then did he try because generally people take something on to achieve a sense of completeness, whether it's a career, whether it's a spouse, it's children. And if one is unable to achieve that completeness in devotional service, then the platform of Varnashrama is that one finds that stable shelter based on experiencing one and fulfilling the holes in one's heart through family, children, career, etc., and using that as a means to go closer to Gopinath and ultimately filling in the Krishna-shaped hole that is actually there in the heart, that we're trying to fill in with many other things. But Priyavrata Maharaj was already at the platform where he had completely accepted Krishna. So why then did he need these things to fill the hole in his heart? And this was a discussion between Manu, Narada, and Brahma, because Narada, as a spiritual master, told him, leave. Manu had come in and said, there's nobody to rule, please rule. And Brahma, as a spiritual master of both, came to resolve the issue. And when he came in, Manu and Narada, because if you have like a Diksha Guru, and the father is another type of Guru, he's a Shiksha Guru. You have two Shiksha Gurus or two Diksha Gurus who come, there's a conflict in their instructions. The way to resolve that is to go to an authority who can resolve both. And this would often happen in Prabhupada's time. Sometimes it is said that in Prabhupada's times, things that now take like years and still are not resolved, Prabhupada would resolve it in a minute. He would just say, no, just do this. No, this is not right, do this. And then things that would brew on for otherwise weeks and months would just be resolved immediately. But then when Brahma came there, he then, in a set of instructions to Maharaj Priyavata, he basically conveyed three things. He said, if one is within the modes of nature, then it is important to act according to those modes. This is similar to instruction that the Lord gives in the 3rd chapter. He gives an analogy of a bull and a rope that you tie around the nose of a bull. And he said, all of us, including himself and Shiva, are bound by the injunctions of the Vedas. As long as we are conditioned within this world, we are bound by duties and principles that we have to act on, because they're meant for our advancement and benefit. And if we don't act according to those things, the noose becomes tighter and we are punished. But then he said, if somebody is actually liberated already, then for them these duties are no longer important. But nonetheless, he considers that if one is still in having a material body, he has the last remnants of karma, what is typically known as prarabdha karma, which is still giving him this body. And so such liberated souls, they don't seek enjoyment or suffering, but whatever comes their way, they just take it as, this is my karma. Actually, the Lord mentions this in the 5th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. He says that they consider is just the gunas interacting with each other. Like if you take a rasgulla, that is the transformation of the mode of ignorance. It is a transformation of the element of ignorance. The tongue, the element of taste, is a transformation of the mode of passion. The mind is a transformation of the mode of goodness. So when you put a rasgulla on the tongue, and you're experiencing a sensation in your mind, and of course that's also controlled by demigods, it is simply transformations of the modes of nature which are producing, one, that sense of taste, that titillation of the mind, and that ability to taste and ability to experience things in the mind that are controlled by the demigods. Ultimately, you also have incarnations of the Lord that control these elements. But it is just the modes of nature interacting with each other. And I'm a spirit soul, I've got nothing to do with this. I'm just somewhat interacting with them. I'm identifying with them, but actually I am none of these senses. And so therefore, a liberated soul, he experiences everything, but he doesn't identify with them. In that way, he's not caught in bondage. And then he says, but actually, you are a devotee. You are neither somebody who is, required to perform these activities, and nor are you just a liberated soul. You're a devotee. And but you, Brahma says, having taken shelter of the lotus feet of the Lord with the lotus navel, having transformed your senses from enemy to friend, should enjoy the objects given by the Lord. It is the Lord's injunction that you take up this service. And therefore, as service, you take it up. And especially when the senses are attached to Gopinath, the bhakti in one's heart acts as a compass throughout one's life. And this is actually the greatest protection that a devotee has. This comes out so strongly in the 6th canto, Bhagavatam. But for devotees, their bhakti is like when they pick up a book, like even if it's like a standard book, say Bhagavad Gita, without Prabhupada's commentaries. When they read another commentary, they will just say, no, this is not right. This is not right. Because their heart acts like that kind of compass. And this topic comes out in Prahlad Maharaj's teachings to Hiranyakashipu. Hiranyakashipu asks him, you are speaking so much that Vishnu is the goal of the Vedas, but here are Sanda and Amarka, and they are scholars. You are a child. They're the sons of Shukracharya, and they don't say Krishna is the topic of the Vedas. And Prahlad Maharaj's answers, they don't have impressions of bhakti. They are navigating through the Vedas with enmity towards the Lord. So therefore, their compass takes them away from Krishna. But when the same devotees, when our acharyas go through the Vedas, they are able to see how everything points towards Krishna. And so this was Brahma's point towards Priyavrata. It is a service. It is the Lord's service that he has given you. So take it as a service. Should enjoy the objects given by the Lord. Later, giving up household life, you should worship the Lord. Maharaj Priyavrata, therefore, he took it up as a service. Now, his activities, now it's amazing how there are no, in the fourth canto, when we speak about Dhruva Maharaj, for example, his prayers are described in some detail. The prayers of the Prachetas are described in their, and the instructions they get from Lord Shiva are described in detail. But with respect to Maharaj Priyavrata, what is rather described is his extraordinary activities in maintaining the universe. The theme of the fifth canto is Sthana. So this is the part of Priyavrata's incidents that are highlighted. It is described. He destroyed, Priyavrata was established for protecting the conduct of the Lord. He destroyed the attachment that arises from household life by meditating on the Lord. He produced sons who were abundant in conduct and qualities. 3 among these 10 sons, he had produced 10 sons, namely Kavi, Mahavir, and Savana, lived in complete celibacy. Thus, trained in brahmachari life beginning from childhood, they were very conversant with knowledge of Atma and entered the Paramahamsa ashrama. In his other wife, he had 2 wives. Maharaj Priyavrata begot 3 sons, namely Uttama, Tamasa, and Raivata. All of them later took charge of the Manvantaras. They became manas later on. While these sons were engaged in the path of sense control, Priyavrata, with powerful mind, Mahamana Bubuje, he ruled the earth, and here what is described is his power, what he enjoyed, and his tremendous influence. While these sons were engaged in the path of sense control, Priyavrata, with powerful mind, ruled the earth for 110 million years, and conquered his enemies by the mere sound of his bow, drawn by 2 arms filled with strength arising from constant prowess, even though he seemed to have forgotten himself and to have lost his sense of discrimination by the constant increasing joy expressed by his wife, by her actions, feminine qualities, her laughing glances restricted by her shyness, and her attractive, joking words. Priyavrata reigned while the sun, going around Meru, lit up half the surface of the earth while the other half was dark. Attaining superhuman power by worship of the Lord, Priyavrata, discontent with the condition that it was day and night, he wanted to create constant day, thinking that he would make the day into night by his brilliant chariot, which traveled at the speed of the sun, becoming like a second sun, followed the movement of the sun 7 times. The troughs created by the wheels of his chariot produced the 7 oceans, from which 7 continents were formed. And this is a verse that summarizes Priyavrata's activities. Such power is not surprising from persons who have conquered the 6 senses by the dust of the lotus feet of the Lord, since even an outcast becomes immediately free of bondage by karma, by chanting the Lord's name once. So Priyavrata's influence, power, and enjoyment stems from his devotional service, his protection of the world, his creating a system, or his creating practically the Bhumandala system as we have it now, was due to his power, the power of his devotional service. This is how the 5th canto begins to introduce sthana, geography, or the maintenance of the universe by the Lord. Now, just before we go ahead, as a brief description of the content of the 5th canto, we have 26 chapters, and the 5th canto naturally has 2 divisions. We have the first division of 1 to 15, which describes the descendants of Maharaj Priyavrata. So in the first 3 chapters, you have Priyavrata, Agnidhara, and Nabhi. Nabhi's son was Rishabha, Rishabdev, an incarnation of the Lord, and his activities and instructions form the content of chapters 4 through to 6. Maharaj Bharata, who was the eldest son of Rishabha, his activities and pastimes and his the life lessons that he learned and taught us through his example are described in chapters 7 through to 14. And then Maharaj Gaya is described in 15. After that point, Maharaj Parikshit asks for a description of Jambudvipa. So from 16 to 19, Jambudvipa is described, particularly the prayers of the residents there. 20, you have other islands and mountains and rivers. That is the other of the islands on Bhumandala. In 2 chapters, 21, 22, the zodiac, the sun, moon, stars, etc. are described. 23, Dhruvaloka. 24, 25, the lower planetary systems. 26, the hellish planets. Now, in this natural division, the first half of the 5th canto, it speaks about the life of various personalities who, by their activities, established a lot of the geography that we have in the universe, and through whom the Lord established the maintenance of the universe. In the latter half of the 5th canto, the full description of the geography is described, not with a view to provide technical detail, but with a view of describing how the residents of each of these places are connected to the Lord, and how these different places are created by the Lord for 2 reasons. One, for living entities of different kinds of mentalities to experience what they need to experience in this world. For example, there are particular asuras who have a nature. For them, there's a particular realm and particular type of realm given to them to experience what they have to experience. But at the same time, we hear about how Ananta maintains the entire universe, and the hellish planetary systems are there for those who cross the line set by the Lord. So that not only do living entities experience what they have come to experience, but they're also able to grow. In this way, the 5th canto, as an overall theme, provides the maintenance of the universe by the Lord, and how he wants living entities to experience what they have come to experience as conditioned souls, but also grow towards him. In this particular class, we have 20 minutes. We will go through the first 10 chapters, if we can, of the 5th canto. We've covered the first chapter of Maharaj Priyavrata already. And many actually devotees, when they look at the 5th canto, they want to specifically focus on the cosmology. But one Acharya actually describes the cosmology is meant to understand and appreciate the glories of Narayan. And when one understands more than even Sarga and Visarga, primary and secondary creation, when one understands the magnitude of what the Lord has created, then a sense of awe, a sense of the grandeur and splendor of even a particle of the Lord's energy becomes understood. And that really leads to a feeling like Krishna can actually protect me. Because one of the items of Sharanagati is Gotriptve Varanam Tata, that I can be completely maintained by the Lord. I don't need to go anywhere else. He is maintaining the entire universe. So why do I need to go anywhere else? Okay. So in the second chapter, we have Agnidra. So Agnidra was the eldest son of Priyavrata, and he was a mixed devotee. We see that because when he wanted a wife, he approached Brahma, not the Lord. And Brahma was pleased to give him an apsara from his own kingdom, Purvachiti, who was extremely attractive, was also attracted to Agnidra's qualities. Agnidra, he begot 9 sons, headed by Nabhi, and then Kim Purusha, Harivarsha, Ilavrita, Ramyaka, Hiranmaya, Kuru, Bhadrasva, and Ketumala. And these 8 children, they set the names for the islands in Jambudvip. Again, Priyavrata's family was involved in the creation of the geography of this world, because he gave each of the islands to one of these kings to rule. Purvachiti gave birth to these 9 sons, 1 each year, but left them in the house of the king and again approached Lord Brahma. She was an Apsara. She belonged to Lord Brahma's court. Because of drinking the breast milk of their mother, the 9 sons of Agnidra naturally had long limbs and strength. Thus, the sons of Agnidra ruled different parts of Jambudvip that they had received from their father. These kingdoms were named according to the names of the sons. By actions in accordance with the Vedic injunctions, King Agnidra, always thinking of her, Purvachiti, his wife, with great desire, was promoted to the same planet as his celestial wife, where the Pitris live in great delight. So there, Agnidra's topic is closed, and that's the second chapter of the fifth canto. And describing that lineage, we come to know one important point with regards to Sthana, that the Jambudvipa Islands were named after Agnidra's sons. Chapter 3. The eldest son of Agnidra was Nabhi. Sukadeva said, now Nabhi is actually very, very important because of his bhakti, he was a great devotee of the Lord. And the Lord was pleased to appear as Nabhi's son. Nabhi, son of King Agnidra, desiring sons, worshipped the Supreme Lord with great attention, along with his wife Meru Devi, who had not produced any sons. Nabhi was a great devotee of the Lord, and the Lord, out of love for his devotee, showed Nabhi his own personal form. And the priests, the assembly, and King Nabhi, like poor persons who have attained the greatest treasure, began worshipping with great reverence the Lord by offering suitable ingredients. The Lord's form is described. He had 4 arms, wearing yellow cloth, marked with shining shrivats on his chest, holding the conch, lotus, club, and wheel, wearing a garland and the kaustubha jewel, and ornamented with a most radiant crown, earrings, bracelet, belt, necklace, armbands, and ankle bells. The priests prayed to the Lord, saying that they had some material desire, because they wanted a son for Nabhi. And they said, we are foolish to ask you for this material desire. Like the example they give is, like a poor man approaching a wealthy man for some empty husks, like the rice of husk. We can ask for anything from you, but we're asking simply for a son. And this is our stupidity and foolishness. Please forgive this offense in approaching you with such a petty desire. But they also prayed, along with this material desire, we have a little bit of bhakti. So this Nabhi, he is true, he has material desire, but that is not his fault. He is covered by your Maya, and your Maya is so strong that it makes people think they want things they don't actually need. But just please, if you can, if you would be pleased to, please fulfill this desire. And the Lord said, O Brahmanas, because they were Vaishnava Brahmanas, you have requested for a son like me, for King Nabhi, and your words, being my devotees, cannot prove false. It is impossible to find a son like me, so I myself will become Nabhi's son. And that was the end of the 3rd chapter. In the 4th chapter, there's a description actually towards the end of the 3rd chapter of the extreme affection that Nabhi had for Rishabdev. But Lord Rishabdev specifically came to show the path of Dharma to Paramahamsa. So go back to the definition of Sthana, where the Lord protects Dharma for specific classes of people. Rishabdev Maharaj had appeared to protect the path of Dharma of the Paramahamsas. So he managed the kingdom after his father Nabhi, begot 100 sons headed by King Bharata, and then lived as a Paramahamsa. Among his sons, Bharata the eldest was a great yogi, devotee, having excellent qualities, actually Bhava Bhakti. Because of him, this planet is called Bharata. In addition to these, famous sons of Rishabdev Maharaj was Kavi, Havi, Antariksha, Prabhuddha, Pipalayana, Avihotra, Dhrumila, Chamasa, Karabhajana. And these form the Nava-Yogendras referenced in the first 5 chapters of the 11th canto, whose realizations and discussions of bhakti establish the path of liberation from this world as a standard conversation. Now, the highlight of Maharaj Rishabdev's instruction that Prabhupada was very deeply fond of is, of course, in the 5th chapter. And this is prefaced as follows. Once while traveling, Rishabha, the Supreme Lord, arriving at Brahmavarta, he taught his attentive sons who were self-controlled and filled with obedience and devotion in an assembly of the best brahmanas and sages, while the citizens listened. He spoke as follows. So Rishabdev Maharaj, he was instructing his sons for the benefit of people in general. Again, when we think about sthana, the protection of dharma for people in general, the general maintenance of the public, It includes helping people set a path of general dharma that people can use and follow and go back to him. Now, chapter 5 has 7 sections. The very first section establishes that the human body should not just be used for sense gratification. This is a verse that Prabhupada quotes very often. Nayam deho deha bhajam ranoke kashtan kaman arhate vidbhujam ye tapo divyam putraka yena sattvam shudyed yasmad brahma saukyam tvanantam. The jiva should not use this human body for that sense gratification that causes difficulty. He should perform austerity, tapo divyam, that helps him purify his mind and achieve the Lord. So it establishes the basic principle of human civilization. And again, these are not specific instructions by the Lord for his devotees. They are a general principle for the maintenance of all living entities, because without bhakti, it is impossible for any result to come in this world, whether one wants material desire or even liberation. And so therefore, for people to want to achieve anything, whether it's a presidency, whether it is some good job or even a good wife, they have to worship the Lord. And worship of the Lord is best conducted when one understands that one is an eternal soul and one is growing through many, many lives, not just taking the experience of one life. And to establish that platform, Maharaj Rishabdev has begun to give these instructions. And the general tenor of his instructions is to speak on the platform of the need for self-realization. His emphasis is not on pure bhakti directly. In the first section, he establishes that the human life should be used for austerities, for growth, internal growth. In the second section, he establishes that internal growth should be directed towards the Atma. And the verse that Prabhupada used to quote a lot was, Parabhavas tavad abodha jato yavan ajigyasata atma tattvam yavat kriyas tavad idam manovai karmatmakam yena sharira bandha. As long as the jiva does not inquire about the Atma, he remains in bondage created by ignorance. As long as one performs pious or sinful actions, the mind remains absorbed in action. By this, the bondage to repeated bodies continues. And the essential point here is that it is insufficient to perform fruitive activities. And another point he makes in this section is that one should have affection for me. By having his mind fixed upon me, he will be able to maintain his focus on the Atma. If he stops fixing his mind upon me, then that mind which needs taste somewhere, rather than taking that taste in my form, will take that taste in the rasa of this world. And so then his stability of Atma realization will be taken away. And he'll be forced to go back towards sensory activities. In the third section, he specifically increases the element of bhakti. And rather than focusing on just Atma Gyan with an element of bhakti, he focuses on bhakti which is aided by elements of jnana. So there, his particular emphasis is on by chanting my glories, by taking other suffering as one's own, basically by hearing and chanting about me, by actions dedicated to me. And this is supported by activities such as living in a solitary place, control of the senses, study of the scriptures, celibacy, etc. In the following section, he begins to say that one should approach a guru for this knowledge. And then he says even the guru who's teaching this knowledge should be self-realized. And the guru himself should be progressing towards that goal. In the sixth section, he says, the fifth section, he says, understand that I am purely spiritual, and you, specifically the sons, should follow Bharat. So I've given these general instructions for others. Now you specifically worship me as your Lord, and Bharat as your Guru. So take instructions from him and approach me. Then to teach living entities in general that they should worship Brahmanas and Vaishnavas, he establishes a hierarchy of living entities, starting from the lowest living entity, trees, plants, animals, human beings, finally up to Brahmanas and then Vaishnavas. And his point is worship the Brahmanas and Vaishnavas as part of your general service to me. But at the end of that section, he says, respect every living entity. Do not disrespect every living entity, seeing me in everybody's heart. And his final conclusion is a general instruction about bhakti. Serve me with all 11 senses, including the mind. This alone is worship of me. Without this, there cannot be freedom from the noose of death. And the point of his saying this is that bhakti is needed wherever you are in life. Whether you want any type of liberation, any type of thing you want in this world, you have to worship me. So keep that as a priority in your life. So these are the 7 sections that describe Maharaj Rishabhadev's instructions. It goes on, I think, for about 47 odd verses. Prabhupada loved that chapter so much, and there are several verses that he would quote again and again. If we had time, we could go through sections of Prabhupada's purports. So end of chapters 5 and 6 describe Rishabhadev Maharaj's activities as a Paramahamsa, because that was the Dharma he had come to establish. So, after accepting the dress of an Avaduta, Lord Rishabhadev acted like a dull person, blind, deaf, and mute, like a ghost or a madman. When addressed by people, he remained silent, since he had taken a vow of silence. He wandered the earth alone, going here and there through towns, villages, mines, farms. He remained indifferent like an elephant surrounded by flies, though he was humiliated by the insults, scolding, and beatings of low-class people, who sometimes urinated on him, spat on him, threw stones, stool, or dust on him, or passed foul air on him. He was not afflicted, since he did not identify with me or mine and was situated in his spiritual body, understanding that his body composed of the universe. Read that part. When he saw the world was unfavorable for his practice of yoga, he had gone around the world establishing the Dharma of a Paramahamsa, but he saw that people in general were not able to take it. So at that point, he just adopted the vow of a python, remained in one place, sleeping, eating, drinking, urinating, and passing stool there. He rolled in the filth and his body became covered in it. But his body remained spiritual. And this was shown when the wind, fragrant from the smell of his stool, made the place fragrant for 10 yojanas. 1 yojana is, I think, what, 100 kilometers? 100 miles or something. 100 miles. So 10 yojanas is therefore then 1,000 miles. One may think this condition is disgusting for a spiritual body, but this verse indicates that the air became fragrant with the smell of his stool, which indicates his body was spiritual. We're almost reaching the end of this hour. The next section, 7 through to 14, indicates Maharaj Bharat and his activities. Do we want to stop here? What do? What do you feel? No, up to chapter 10 was what I was hoping to cover today. But it depends on the devotees if they have to go somewhere or not. When? 11:30? Oh. Okay. Okay. That's... Okay. So, chapter 7 is now Maharaj Bharat. Now, he was the eldest son of Maharaj Rishabhadev. Rishabhadev had given this example, and then he went back to his abode. But Maharaj Bharat, he was a living entity, and the eldest son, he had bhava. In the 5th chapter, in the 6th chapter, seventh chapter of the 5th canto, there's a description of how he managed and maintained his kingdom, which was basically actually, the entirety of Bhumandala, but without losing his Krishna consciousness. Because it is very natural when you're involved in management and administration to identify with what you're doing and to direct results towards oneself. In particular, there's the 6th verse of the 7th chapter, and this verse is actually quoted very, very frequently throughout many, many, many purports. But he was performing sacrifices so that people in general would retain the sense of culture, the culture of approaching the Vedas, the culture of worshipping a higher authority in the form of demigods, so that they wouldn't become completely cut off and independent. Now, in performing this, he was sponsoring these sacrifices. Now, it is a tenet of pure devotional service that one only approaches Krishna. One does not approach anybody else. But this verse describes how much Bharat, even while engaging in those particular sacrifices, he was able to maintain his consciousness. And there were 4 things that he did. Bharat thought that the results of the sacrifice, whatever result was coming, it was not intended for him. He thought, let this be pleasing to the Lord. Let it be for his purpose. He wants the living entities to go to him. This is an element that he has put in place. May this be done for his pleasure. The second thing that he did was, there are some mantras that the pujaris were chanting that addressed the demigods. And these mantras were capable of revealing the demigods. They would appear in the yogic sacrifice, take the offering that was meant for them. So, he thought, Vasudeva alone is the controller of the devatas. By his will, they are coming. For his service, they are coming. And then he further thought, when he had to meditate on the devatas, he didn't meditate on them in isolation. He thought of them as being limbs of the Lord, like Indra being the arms of the Lord, for example, Surya as being the eye of the Lord. So in that way, he was able to direct all elements of that sacrifice, which was in some sense a karma sacrifice, towards Krishna. And the most important thing pointed out is that he did not have faith that these sacrifices are actually necessary for one's ultimate advancement. He understood deeply that hearing and chanting about Krishna was sufficient. And this is simply like a ritual that has to be performed. Now, in the Vedas, faith is described as an essential element for the success of a sacrifice. If somebody doesn't have faith that the sacrifice is necessary, it doesn't work. So by Bharat Maharaj having faith in hearing and chanting about Krishna, rather than in the sacrifice directly, for him, he was not implicated in that sacrifice. In this way, he completely maintained his separation, even while he was doing things for the benefit of others. The other prominent example that's given is, of course, Maharaj Prithu, but Ambarish Maharaj is the third example. Ambarish Maharaj was a totally different case. Even though he was a ruler of the 7 islands, he was very intelligent, and he delegated the responsibility of all these material duties to every one of his ministers. And during the sacrifice, he had locked himself up in his room and he was just worshipping his deities. So that was how he dealt with it, but this is possibly closer to what we would have to deal with. And by directing all his activities towards the Lord, he was already purified in heart, but bhava became very strongly manifest. The description is his bhakti became Shuddha Sattva. Generally, bhakti at the platform, what this means is that the dham of the Lord, so the Samvit and Sandhini Shaktis, enter the Lord and make the heart a dham for the Lord's residence. This is the stage of bhava. And at this stage, one's subtle body is destroyed, generally speaking. So this was the level of Maharaj Bharat. He ruled for 100 million years. And when he saw that, because normally for us, there's kind of a time span. We understand that when we're getting 50, 60, we understand that we don't have much time left. But for Maharaj Bharat, if somebody is just living on and on for 100 million years, how do you know when to cut your life off and to go and retire to the forest? He couldn't see like a visible end to his life. And so therefore, he just decided, okay, I've ruled enough, I've managed enough, I've protected people enough. Now is the time I need to focus exclusively on the Lord. So he stopped managing the kingdom, he gave it to his eldest son, and he himself went to the forest. It's interesting that so when he went to the forest, he of course engaged in worshipping the Lord. And at the end of the 7th chapter, there's a description of the verse that he used particularly to worship the Lord. It was a verse directed towards the sun on the external surface, but actually it was indicating the form of the Lord directly. Because the result of his performing that worship was, when he was worshiping the Lord in this way, he would forget his normal day-to-day duties because of the ever-increasing intense attraction for the Lord through his constant service. His hair stood on end because of joy. Tears produced by longing for the Lord flowed from his eyes out of affection. His intelligence was immersed in the lake of his heart, filled with the highest bliss through bhakti yoga by intense meditation on the red feet of the Lord, who bestows prema. Now, chapter 8 is interesting. This is the instance where Maharaj Bharat was allured by the presence of the deer. It is described that there are two reasons for this. Jiva Goswami in Bhakti Sandarbha says that there was possibly some unknown offense in Maharaj Bharat's practice. Because of that offense, bhakti, which normally acts as a compass in a person's life, it was slightly blocked. And rather, his mind was directed to, it was attracted to, identifying with the deer and caring for the deer, neglecting the service of the Lord. It was not wrong that he took care of the deer, but the mistake was that he took care of the deer without connecting that service to the service of the Lord. And he began to identify more strongly with the deer than he did as a servant of the Lord. Generally, when one now this is impossible when one is performing devotional service, because by nature bhakti acts like a compass. And so therefore, even if one is like going down the wrong street, for example, and one sees bad things, one immediately thinks, I should not be here, and one just walks out. But if there is some offense in the heart, if one has offended or insulted the Vaishnavas in some way, or one has neglected to follow the order of one's spiritual master, then the mercy of the Lord is cut off, and one becomes more attracted to things of this world. So if the stronger the offense, the stronger this reaction is. But in Bharat Maharaj's case, Jiva Goswami explains that it was an unknown offense. Now, Jiva Goswami says there's a second explanation for this instance, and that is that the Lord did not want Bharat Maharaj to just, because his sadhana was at a particular intensity. And according to the intensity of one's sadhana, one achieves a particular level of intimacy with the Lord. But the Lord wanted actually to give Bharat Maharaj a relationship of greater intensity, a greater intimacy. For that, Bharat Maharaj, his sadhana needed to become still more intense. And the Lord arranged for his fall down. So from his recrimination, from his feeling bad about what he had done, his sadhana would achieve greater intensity and heights, and then his relationship with the Lord would be higher. So Jiva Goswami gives both these explanations. He says some Vaishnavas give the first instance, and some give the second instance. In both situations, we are taught an important lesson. Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur says the second of the two. He focuses on that. Srila Prabhupada, he doesn't offer one or the other reason specifically. He warns of material allurement in the practice of one's devotional service. But the principle to understand is that the practice of bhakti itself is so strong, there's nothing more that can protect a devotee. There's nothing that a devotee needs to do specifically, apart from maintain the principles of devotional service. And so the principles of devotional service include, the first principle actually is avoiding the association of those who are not devotionally inclined. Because by their association, one builds a natural enmity towards the Lord and towards devotees. And that causes offenses, which cause one to deviate. But if one is kept within the circle of devotees naturally, then these tendencies, this enmity naturally is taken from the heart. And one is completely protected as one's kripa goes stronger and stronger, and then one's own bhakti acts as a compass, even as one is moving around the world. And such devotees, they may go out, but they quickly come back. Radhanath Maharaj gives the example of a mongoose that is fighting a snake. Now, if the snake bites the mongoose, of course, the mongoose can die. It's venomous. But the mongoose will often drag the snake to a particular type of ivy plant. And after biting the snake, the mongoose will go and rub itself against that ivy plant because it's like an antiseptic. It will take the poison off and then come back and join the fight. So devotees who engage in such duties or services where they are forced to take such association, they will go out, fight, but then they know when they need to take shelter. They take shelter, come back and join the fight, until the mongoose is finally able to kill the snake. Radha Maharaj described this interesting idea of how a mongoose fights, and he said devotees should learn to do this also. Anyway, so the instance that happened was, a pregnant doe was drinking water, a roar of a lion was heard. In extreme fright, she tried to jump over the river to escape the lion. And as she jumped, she was heavily pregnant. Her baby fell from her womb and into the river. From the shock of the discharge, of her fear of the lion, her loss of her baby, and her separation from her pack, she was weakened by grief and extreme mental distress. In that stage of fatigue, she went into a cave and passed away. And this baby deer was just floating helplessly on the river. Bharat Maharaj was performing his duties near the river. He saw this happen, and he picked up that deer and took him back to his ashram and began to take care of him. But his attachment became so strong that this is what happened. Taking the fawn as his own child, there was identification here. The king daily fed it, protected it, caressed it, and pleased it. Becoming absorbed in the deer by these activities, he gave up his own regulations and rules of conduct and his worship of the Lord bit by bit in a few days. Everything became neglected. Even in the midst of performing worship of the Lord, he would rise and gaze at the deer. Bharat would offer blessings to the deer with mind joyful on seeing it. "O young deer, all blessings to you." Sometimes, not seeing the deer, his mind would become pitifully disturbed, like a miser who has lost his wealth. He would become greatly bewildered and lament. His heart was pained by pangs of separation from the small deer, with longing to see it. He would speak as follows: "Perhaps this young helpless deer whose mother has died, having faith in me, though I'm actually cruel like a cunning or low-class person and having no pious credits, will not consider my offense and return from his wandering in the forest out of kindness. Perhaps I will find out that the deer has been protected by my Lord and is gazing fearlessly on grass in the garden of the hermitage. Perhaps a wolf or jackal or a tiger or a group of animals has eaten the deer. The sun, which gives rise to give benefit to the whole world, is setting. The young deer entrusted to me by his mother has not returned. Perhaps that prince among deer will return, and driving away my grief by his pleasant deer actions will give happiness to me, who have not done any pious activities. When I would close my eyes and fake samadhi in jest, the deer would approach me in great alarm, and out of anger, in love, butt me with the tender tips of his horns, which felt like water drops." From this, you can understand how strong his meditation on the deer was. It's like he was dealing with his own child. And I would say, "O fool, though I nourish you, I will not give up my daily duties of remembering the Lord and chanting his names. I'm giving you up. Go wherever you want." Pretending to be angry, I would then fake samadhi out of desire to see what the deer would do. He was not focusing on the Lord. Out of anger and love, the deer would butt me with the tips of his tender horns, which felt like drops of water. It was so soft and cooling. When the deer would contaminate the ingredients for sacrifice placed on kusha grass, I would scold it. I would say, "Ah, what have you done?" It would then give up its play and remain with motionless senses, fearful, like the son of a sage would sit with restrained senses. Oh, what penance the earth must have done! The earth is indicating the path to wealth for this miserly person who suffers from poverty. He was saying the earth is very pious for being able to hold the deer's footprints. And I'm very impious that I'm not able to behold the deer. The earth has made itself a place of sacrifice for brahmanas desiring to attain liberation by ornamenting itself with these footprints. Seeing and in these thoughts, without his realizing it, somehow or the other, death came to him. And in that phase of his life, seeing the deer lamenting by his side like his son and absorbed in thinking of the deer, he gave up his body in the company of the deer. After the death of his body, without loss of memory of his previous life, he attained the body of a deer as if undergoing karma. By the influence of his worship of the Lord, he could remember the cause of becoming a deer in this life, and he was greatly repentant. And recriminating himself again and again, he left the association of his mother, went back to the Pulaka ashram where he was performing his worship of the Lord, and there re-engaged in his practices of devotional service. Giving up that life, the prayers described by Bharat Maharaj in the form of the deer as he was giving up the life of a deer. In chapter 9, it describes Bharat Maharaj's birth as a son of a Brahmana, and remembering that... Sorry? Okay, we can. Okay. Huh? Yeah, that's completely fine. It's getting late also, I understand. But again, the overriding theme of the fifth canto is sthana, which describes the protection of the Lord, protection of the dharma for living entities by the Lord. It describes the geography, which is the destination of living entities in this world. And looking at the pastimes and themes of the fifth canto in this light, it helps us connect all the pastimes into one central idea of how extraordinary the Lord's power is, his greatness, his kindness. Prabhupada actually once said there are two things we learn from Bhagavatam, the Lord's greatness and the Lord's compassion, his mercy. And both of these things allow us to take shelter of him. Actually, we could stop the study of the fifth canto here, and the rest is detail. But there are many, many wonderful verses, actually, in the prayers of the residents of Jambudvip. Devotees usually approach this canto for the cosmology, but that's not really the purpose of the fifth canto. It's really deep, it's super wonderful. It's amazing. Any final thoughts, comments, questions? Please. The what, sorry? The Jains?
The Jains, yeah. One of them is, of course, the main one is Mahavir, and then there's Rishabh Dev.
Yeah.
Is this the same?
Yes, it is actually the same Rishabh Dev. But Rishabh Dev, it is described in the Bhagavatam that he was the inspiration for the beginning of the Jain sect. But it was actually a misunderstanding. There was a king, I don't remember his name now, but he happened to see, in some scriptures it is described that not the king Vena, not in this incarnation described in the fourth canto Bhagavatam, but in another scripture, it is described that there was a king who happened to see, Hare Krishna, who happened to just see Maharaj Rishabh from a distance. And he decided that he should just imitate those practices. He imitated those practices without understanding their proper purpose, their proper place. So the Jains focus extremely hard on austerities and renunciation.
Yes, that's what I was going to say. How come it's the same Rishabh Dev, but their focus is really deep renunciation?
Well, Maharaj Rishabh's renunciation is far more than Jains could ever have done. I mean, who can, for example, follow the vow of a python? Stay in one place, pass stool, eat whatever just comes to them, be indifferent to people urinating on them, passing stool. This standard of renunciation is only possible for somebody who does not identify with their body. Now, when somebody has to leave their bodily identification, because the nature of the soul is to have an identification, they have to have a sense of I and mine. So if they have to disconnect themselves from the body, they have to latch that sense of I and mine somewhere. And that has to be in the Lord. Because the soul is eternal, the Lord is eternal, the relationship between the soul and the Lord is also eternal. And so therefore we don't say that the sense of I and mine is wrong, we say it is misdirected. But when it is directed towards the Lord, then one identifies as being a servant of the Lord. I am the Lord's servant, the Lord is my master. That identification is really strong. And so for them, the body becomes nothing. And by virtue of the taste they experience in relationship with the Lord, they're able to tolerate everything. And in fact, the Acharyas say there are three qualities by which one's ability to transcend the things of this world is understood. The first one is a person's extreme humility. Second, his extreme tolerance. And three, sweet speech, even in the face of harsh words. But this is only really possible. I mean, people in general are tolerant, humble maybe, and have sweet speech. There are people who have this. But you push them, and there's a limit beyond which they cannot go. The level that Maharaj Rishabdev has described is the level of a Paramahamsa, who is completely detached from the body in every possible way. Now, therefore the activities for such a person can be what Rishabdev Maharaj has described. In the Jain tradition, renunciation is taken as a sadhana, as a practice for people who are incompletely realized. They cannot manifest such renunciation. For them, Shastric injunction is that they are attached, engage in their attachment with religious principles, and through that go to the Lord. For example, I am attached to my wife or my family. But if my wife is a devotee, then because of my attachment to her, I will want to do things that please her. What pleases her is devotional service. I will want to be the best devotee I can be for her. So through my attachment, I become a better devotee. Or I want my children to get the best culture. And for my children to get the best culture, I want them to access Krishna conscious culture. And so I want to be the best example of a devotee I can be, to set the best standards at home that I can for them to become Krishna conscious out of that attachment. So I'll just finish this point off. So this point is not understood by the Jains. What they've seen is that extreme sense of renunciation, and there are people who are attracted to it, and they follow it as a sadhana, even though they're not ready for it. Now, this practice of renunciation doesn't get one anywhere, because it is not by renunciation that one advances. It is by transferring that sense of I and mine from false things to the real thing of substance, even if one is actually in this world. That is important, and that requires purification of heart, not external practices or dresses or renunciation. Sorry, you were saying?
Yeah, so I think like Jains are more or less similar to Buddhists in which they believe in
Slightly different philosophy, but
renunciation.
no, Buddhas in the Buddhist tradition, you don't have as much a focus on renunciation as you do. There is certainly some elements there, but not as complete. And in fact, there are two divisions in Buddhism, Mahayana and Theravada. But in the Mahayana tradition, it's almost like demigod worship, actually. And that's actually that's 80% of Buddhism around the world, actually. 85%, actually. It's more the monastic and renunciate tradition, but that's very, very limited, and very few people can actually practice that. There are some Buddhists, for example, who meditate in a cemetery to understand the temporary nature of life, but you don't get Buddhists who enter the renounced order by plucking out every hair in their body. Yeah. Well, it's not even necessary, and it is not even, not just about Kali Yuga. Such renunciation at every point in time is useless, actually. Where, it's like this. If, there's one very famous author, Gyaneshwar, you may have heard of him in Maharashtra. Now, he was a devotee, and he was also a Gyani. Now, if you know what Gyanis do, typically and historically, they would sit in the middle while there were 4 fires around them. So hot summer, the sun would be beating down on them, they would have 4 fires. So this was to force their mind to leave the conditioning that I need certain comforts which belong to the body for myself, for me to be happy. In winter, they would submerge themselves in ice-cold water and then practice their spiritual life there. But Gyaneshwar, in his commentary on the Bhagavad Gita, he specifically writes, and this is echoed if you look at the commentaries of many, many other established Gyanis. If you look at Sridhar Swami, you look at Gyaneshwar, you look at other such commentators, they will say that the practice of such renunciation without the Lord as the object is like a lady entering a funeral pyre when normally ladies enter the funeral pyre when their husbands have passed away. So that's the practice of sati. It's like a lady entering the funeral pyre without having a husband. Because the idea is that for a lady, their attachment to their husband and they're wanting to follow him into the next life, and rather being that separation from him, not being able to go with him, is more painful than the fire that is consuming their body. And so therefore they're willing to undergo these austerities, not because they like being in fire, but because it's a path that takes them with their husband. So therefore they're willing to undergo that austerity. So those devotees for whom this austerity is necessary, like you see Prabhupada, when he was going to print his books, we talk about 4 fires in the middle of Delhi heat, which goes up to 47, 50 degrees. People pass away on the street with that heat. Prabhupada stood outside a donor's house for 5 rupees for 3 hours because that donor had promised him 5 rupees to print his Bhagavatam books. So for the purpose of his, and Prabhupada didn't even know if you had vegetarian foods in the West. He was prepared to live on cereal, if required, to preach in the West. For a devotee, he decides on his service and then takes on austerities in order to conduct that service. So if devotees have to go and perform deity worship in the morning, even if it's freezing cold and the shower water is cold, they will take a bath and they will go. But they don't just wake up in the morning and take pleasure in a cold bath for the sake of renunciation. When there's a husband, it is worth going on to the pyre, if that relationship is deep enough. That is the point that Jains miss. They've taken the renunciation without understanding its purpose. I don't know if that was your question or that was just a comment. Yes, but Rishabdev was the original. His purpose was different, but seeing him, people had adopted certain practices, yes.
Yeah, I know, but what had, why I was kind of mesmerized with it because not Rishabdev was really without ability, and that's why I asked you to finish that with it. And his purpose is so wonderful that as explained, there was a Jain is like out of context. You know what I mean?
But that happened even with Lord Chaitanya.
That's what the
But that...
kind of separated just that renunciation to a certain point. That's what the practice is.
Yeah, but that's not so strange. Like, for example, if you have somebody who's, for example, a bodybuilder, and you see him on TV, you see that there's a particular physical routine he does to maintain his body. You'll get kids who just try things on their own without a proper understanding of how to balance their life. They see a boxer, like when you would have Muhammad Ali, for example, and they would see his fights. Then you would have kids who would want to just learn boxing, and they would just, go ahead and try something and build their muscles in some way without understanding the full process of doing so. So imitation has always been there, because every person has their own purpose. When they don't want to surrender completely and follow and have their heart molded according to a teacher, then they take elements that are suitable for their own life and just follow what is suitable for their own life. So it is not so surprising. Even in Lord Chaitanya's time, what Lord Chaitanya taught was taken and distorted by many, many, many other sects. Even people who were renowned as being saints took Lord Chaitanya's certain principles and they distorted them. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta had to fight quite hard to remove those sects.
Yeah, because you do sometimes with the media, you see people who say, oh, look at this person, they're not, and they're going over, crying and stuff, but that's just imitation, it's not really talk about.
No, it's not. And the same thing, I mean, you get so many like Babajis around Radhakund who have their own practice without understanding the proper procedure of how to attain those exalted levels. Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Granth Srimad Bhagavatam ki, Srila Prabhupada ki, Gaur Premanande. Radha Gopinath.